there are many skills and dispositions that then come into the frame. And of course, everything hinges on the relationship that people have with each other and the amount of trust. And sometimes, and I work with schools where, that's the first conversation that we're having, that maybe the first couple of meetings are really about building relationships, building trust, and thinking about what it means to be and to develop that culture of inquiry within your school. And I think if teachers don't have it, then it's going to be really difficult to build that with students, right? But I also think that at some point, when you start having those conversations, that teachers really benefit from having a protocol-driven conversations about portfolios or about documentation in general. I just came back from a workshop in Italy where this was about student learning, but we were using a protocol to talk about student learning, about the documentation. And I think it really supports people because it is a way of thinking, right? Like the questions lead and there's a logic there, I think. But it also ensures that there is participation and equal participation. So I think that really helps. So I can imagine that as a team, you can also think of some sort of protocol that you want to develop to talk about the documentation that you've developed about your own learning.
Yeah, protocols are, like you said, those powerful structures to get us thinking. Also builds that sense of psychological safety, right? So it kind of levels the playing field. And yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm like, okay, what's next? What's next, right? Helps us feel like we can kind of maybe lower our affective filter just a little bit to be able to reveal a little bit more about ourselves.
Like I think also through the protocol and through that work, you also build trust. Hey, like like just talking about trust is not the way you build trust. Like that takes time and it's a different process for different people. But I think that it could be really interesting to have points in time during the school year that you talk with your colleagues about your learning process and where you're at with that thinking, and that you use a protocol for that.
Yeah, essential. There's a collaborative space on the campus that I'm a leader at. It's called the Learning Hub. And so it's just a space we get to use. And my principal was guiding some new families on a tour. And I love that she shares and showcases that space because it documents our learning and thinking as teachers, as learners. And so right then and there, it's showing the things that we value as a school, that we value as educators. And you could see the parents like look around like, whoa, there's a lot of things that happen. It's not just plug and chug. There's a lot of unpacking and exploring. And that documentation became an invitation, even though they might not necessarily know, the academic vocabulary or the language around it, but they could get a sense of the learning journey and the learning story and what it is that we value just by having some sort of documentation as a school. So something too that I love to see an outsider coming in and looking at documentation and seeing how they respond to it as well.
Yeah, and this is where we bump into something that is perhaps quite specific, but it is important, I think, particularly when the documentation is visually in this space, is how do we support the readers then also to make sense of it? Where do you start? Like that, I know it seems silly, but it is an important piece. I think if you would create some sort of online portfolio, like it often has that sort of a social media interface and you scroll. But it doesn't have to be. You could use something else as well, right? More like a web type of thing on a Miro platform or whatever. But I think, like particularly those boards that live in the school, how do we create these boards in such a way that readers actually can make sense of it? That is actually quite a challenge, I think, because for us it does, right? For people that walk in, how do you make sense of that story?
Yeah. Two things come to mind, Anne, when I think about that. One of them, of course, I learned from an early years educator because my goodness, I learned so much from them. She numbers parts of her learning wall. And this, again, is a student learning wall. It's not her own learning wall. And again, to support the students to go back. What did we do first? What did we do second? What did we do third? So there's numbers along with artifacts that tell the story. So it makes me think of just that, right? Number sense in a sort of cyclical way. It also makes me think of a timeline. To me is also like a really easy way to kind of like move across a space. And so whether you are native to the language or not, or an educator or not, I'm wondering what you think about those two invitations for somebody coming outside and being invited to the learning space as well.
Yeah, I've also seen people use the inquiry cycle. That would be another one, that you can do quite easily. Hey, with these different stages of the inquiry cycle, that would be another way to kind of frame it or like suggest a way of reading it, right? Like that's also quite nice, I think, because you're making these kind of quite explicit connections. I've also seen people that use PowerPoint and then print it off, and they would hang that sort of beside each other. And I know it sounds kind of silly and a little obvious, but even then within each slide, you got to think about where you place things, right? And how do you make it visually interesting? So I think also for teachers' own documentation, I think what happens through this process is that you really have to make decisions about, what were the key moments in this journey. And I guess the more you zoom out and the more you tell a story over time, you keep on making different choices about what were key moments in the way you come to know something. Which is an interesting process, I think.
Yeah. And gosh, talk about higher order thinking too for ourselves too as educators. Of course, those in learning pioneers are engaged in some really deep learning. But if an educator has never thought about that, well, what would be a key moment? My curriculum doesn't tell me. So what is it? Right. And so, gosh, think about that kind of cognitive friction they're faced in that moment too.
Yeah. Yesterday, I was asking the question because we started with this whole idea of listening. Hey, I guess when we talk about teacher education, documentation would be kind of listening to yourself and observing, documenting, slowing down, giving it time, thinking a little bit more. But also, what are you listening for? Documentation. I think often also with children and it's often focused on progress, or it's focused there these beautiful photographs. And don't get me wrong, the photographs are important. But I think it really is those key moments that we need to focus on. Hey, a key moments in the way that learners are making sense of something. Like somebody may have said something or has made a connection or is stuck or brings a point of view. And then all of a sudden there's something interesting to talk about. And the same thing happens with adults, right? And I think particularly those moments where your own thinking is being challenged, when you're kind of stuck and you're grappling with something, I think often that's where you have to go, because that's where there's something to learn. There's something for you there.
When you're sharing it makes me think about just the intentionality and being really present. And how do we do that, right? Might this process be a way that we nudge ourselves towards that presence, towards that mindfulness, towards that mindful listening? What are we listening for? How can we know that we're listening for something, but still be open for what it is that we're actually listening for is also it. So I think it's almost like a mindfulness practice, if you will. And we know the impact of a mindfulness practice on who we are as humans. And so I often think about, this approach to our practice is really just helping us be a better human being, more healthy, maybe a little bit more balanced and not as stretched as so many educators are, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it's not easy, hey, particularly if I think of like you've been with the students all day, you rush into a meeting, or it's the end of the day. There is a lot going on, but kind of deliberately bringing us into a space where we can be present and where we can be mindful of our own processes is important, I think, in order to learn. Because I think our job is so much about who we are, and we feel so attached to it, and we're so passionate about it. And I think it's what makes educators such beautiful people, right?